Okay, so are you ready to dive into something really juicy today?
I am. Shoot. What do we have?
We're talking about the intersection of religion and psychoanalysis, how our minds work, those messy relationships we have, and how it all ties into something bigger than ourselves.
It's fascinating stuff. We're really exploring how our understanding of psychology, especially our relationships, can shed light on our experience of faith and spirituality, whether we consider ourselves religious or not.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you gave me James W. Jones's Religion and Psychology in Transition. This book is dense, but so good.
Oh, it's a classic for a reason. Where are we starting?
Well, we're starting with Freud, obviously. But then we're going to dive into some really fascinating thinkers who challenged his ideas, people like Fairbairn, Kohut. I mean, it gets juicy.
The really intriguing part for me is how these different schools of thought, especially this thing called relational psychoanalysis, grapple with this age-old question: what's the connection between our inner world and our experiences of faith? Meaning maybe even the divine.
Big questions. So let's unpack Freud first. I feel like Jones starts there, laying the groundwork. And I have to admit, when I hear Freud, I immediately think Oedipus complex.
Right, the classic. But what Jones is highlighting is Freud's bigger picture view of religion. It's more than just family dramas. Freud saw religion as this reaction to our most basic instincts, the stuff we're all trying to repress.
Okay, so like religion is this kind of societal superego, keeping our deepest, darkest desires in check.
Exactly. It's almost like we're trading in those primal urges for civilization, and religion is part of that bargain. Freud even went so far as to compare the whole primal murder thing in Totem and Taboo to the Christian idea of original sin.
Wow, okay, that's a heavy comparison. But it does make you think, right? Like, are we hardwired for this struggle between our base instincts and the need for, like, social order with religion stuck in the middle?
That's what Freud thought. He argued that our social bonds, morality, even that longing for something bigger than ourselves, it all comes back to repressing those primitive drives.
I get that, but it's a little, well, limited, don't you think? Like, we're just stuck trying to tame our inner caveman.
It's definitely a starting point. But you're right, it's not the whole story. And thankfully, Jones doesn't stop there. He brings in W.R.D. Fairbairn, who had a totally different perspective.
Okay, good, because we need more than just our inner caveman.
Right. Fairbairn was like, hold on, Freud. Relationships are what really shape us, especially those early bonds, particularly with the mother. Like, he really believed that was central to our development.
So it's not just about squashing down those primal urges. It's about how those early relationships nurture us, or, let's be honest, sometimes totally failed to nurture us.
100%. And here's a fascinating little tidbit. Fairbairn himself was a devout Christian, but he never actually met this philosopher named John McMurray.
Okay.
McMurray also stressed the importance of the personal in his work, like crazy similar ideas. It makes you wonder.
Are we talking coincidence?
Yeah.
Or something a bit more, like they both tapped into something essential about being human?
Right. Maybe this deep-seated need for connection is just part of who we are. And that, as we'll see, has huge implications for how we understand religious experiences.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Okay, speaking of relationships, Jones then introduces us to Kohut and his idea of self-objects. It sounds a little technical, but the idea itself is pretty relatable.
It is, yeah. Kohut argued that we need other people, those self-objects, to mirror us, to make us feel seen, to idealize us a bit, to give us that sense of belonging. And these aren't just nice to haves, they're crucial for us to develop in a healthy way.
So you're saying that even for people who aren't religious, there's this fundamental human need that Kohut's tapping into. And maybe, just maybe, some people seek that fulfillment, that mirroring in a higher power.
Exactly. If those needs aren't met in our early relationships, we might start searching for them somewhere else, something bigger than ourselves, like maybe a God who provides those missing pieces.
Which leads us to those case studies in Jones's book, right? Phil and Maxine.
Yes. Jones uses those stories to show how those early relationship patterns, especially with family, really show up in our experiences of God, of religion.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with Phil. What do we know about him?
Phil is described as a very successful guy, publishing executive, nice clothes, you know the type. But beneath the surface, he's battling this really intense anxiety, a lot of stress.
The classic high-powered executive who's secretly falling apart. What's going on there?
Well, through therapy, this really striking pattern emerged. Phil's relationship with God was almost identical to his relationship with his father, distant, demanding, all about earning approval.
It's like that old saying, God is a father. But in Phil's case, it was his own demanding, distant dad who was casting the bigger shadow.
Exactly. Phil even admitted he'd never really felt a personal connection with God. It was more about duty, rules, not messing up, which,
It sounds exactly like how he learned to survive in his family. It's like he unconsciously sought out a religious community that mirrored those familiar patterns, even if they weren't the healthiest.
and you see it playing out in his anxieties, right? That fear of failing, of not being good enough, it's there in his work, in his religious life.
It makes you wonder how much of how we approach faith is really about replicating those early dynamics, even if we have no idea we're doing it.
It's a huge question.
Yeah.
Now, in contrast to Phil, we have Maxine, who, at least on the surface, seems like, the picture of a secular humanist. She's a pediatrician working in a really tough clinic, all about social justice and super skeptical of religion, of any organized religion for that matter.
Okay, so two very different people. But Jones gives us a glimpse into where some of Maxine's skepticism comes from, right? Her dad was a staunch Marxist, no time for religion at all. But then there's that other layer, her grandfather.
Yes. Her grandfather was a very devout Jewish man, and he had this incredible warmth about him. He would tell Maxine these magical stories from Jewish tradition, really vivid stuff.
And for young Maxine, her grandfather and the world of faith that he represented became this refuge for her, an escape from her chaotic family life.
Until tragedy struck. Her grandfather passed away when she was just entering adolescence.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's rough. That's a lot for anyone to process, let alone someone that young.
Right. And that loss, combined with her father's very strong anti-religion stance, kind of pushed Maxine to embrace atheism. But here's the thing. Her reasoning was deeply personal. It was rooted in this intense grief, this feeling of abandonment by God, the God who she felt took away something precious from her.
It's like she equated believing in God with experiencing this unbearable pain, this loss.
Yeah, it's like this defense mechanism almost. And you see it play out in how resistant she is to even talking about religion, even in therapy. It just brought up too much unresolved grief for her.
Both Phil and Maxine's stories are so powerful because they show us that our relationship with faith, it's rarely simple. It's this mix of our early experiences, our personality, and those unconscious needs and desires that we're just starting to unpack.
And that's what makes relational psychoanalysis so insightful, don't you think? It helps us understand not just what people believe, but why they believe it. Maybe even more importantly, how those beliefs shape how they actually live their lives.
Okay, so we've seen how Freud saw religion as like this response to our primitive instincts, this need to repress.
Huh.
While Fairbairn and Kohut, they shifted the focus to these crucial early relationships and how those shape us. But if we zoom out a bit, how does this relational model, this way of thinking, how does it change how we think about theology itself? Can we even talk about God in a relational way?
Now, those are the million-dollar questions, and that's exactly where we're going next time. We'll be exploring how folks like Buber and McMurray tackled those very issues.
Okay, so last time we were trying to wrap our heads around Freud's take on religion and then those really interesting challenges from Fairbairn and Kohut. It feels like things are about to get even juicier as we dig into Buber and McMurray.
You're telling me, remember how Freud saw religion as this, byproduct of our primal instincts, the stuff we're supposedly repressing?
Right, try to keep that inner caveman locked up.
Exactly. Well, relational psychoanalysis really starts to open up some different ways of thinking about theology. It even hints at how those primal urges, that desire for connection, might actually be pointing us towards something spiritual.
Okay, so less about squashing down the caveman and more about how that longing for connection could be a sign of something more. I like where this is going.
It's a different way of looking at it, for sure.
It is. So let's dig into Buber a bit. I've heard about this whole I-thou relationship thing, but I could use a little refresher. What is that all about?
So at the heart of it is this idea that we exist in relation to others. Like, we don't just exist as these separate egos bouncing off each other. It's a much deeper interconnectedness. It's really about what it means to be human.
So less like isolated islands and more like we're all part of this, like giant web of connections.
Exactly. And Buber talks about two ways we can approach these relationships. He calls them I-it and I-thou. But it's not about literally labeling people as things or objects. It's more about the quality of attention that we're bringing to our interactions.
Okay, so what's the difference? Give me an example.
Let's say you're at the grocery store, right?
Yeah.
In that I-it mode, you're just focused on getting your stuff, checking out, basically treating everyone like, well, obstacles in your way. But in that I-thou mode, you might actually see the cashier. Make eye contact. Have a genuine interaction, even if it's brief.
Same scenario, totally different vibe.
Right. It's less about what you can get from that person and more about, like, recognizing their humanity.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. And this applies to more than just how we treat the cashier at the grocery store, right?
Oh, absolutely. And here's where Bober gets really interesting. He said, we can have this I-thou relationship not just with people, but with anything. Nature, art, music, even, like, abstract ideas.
Wow. So it's about approaching, well, everything with openness and respect, this deep sense of connection.
Yes. And for Buber, this is the very foundation of religious experience. It's about tapping into that sense of something way bigger than ourselves, something sacred that's woven into, well, everything.
You know, it's funny you say that. I was just thinking about how I get this super profound sense of peace when I'm just sitting by the ocean. You know, I wouldn't necessarily call it a religious experience, but it definitely feels like I'm in touch with something bigger than myself.
And that's the power of what Buber's talking about. It resonates with people even if they don't subscribe to a specific religion. It's about being open to that sense of the sacred, that thou that's present in the world around us.
Okay, so we've got Buber's beautiful vision of interconnectedness with his I-thou stuff, which I'm still kind of wrapping my head around, to be honest. But where does John McMurray fit into all of this? He was a philosopher, right?
He was. And like Buber, he also believed that we are, at our core, relational beings. He took it a step further, though. He argued that our understanding of what it means to be human, like our fundamental identity, it's all rooted in community, in our relationships with other people.
So it's less about this every man for himself mentality and more about recognizing that who we are is formed in this web of relationship.
Exactly. And McMurray takes it even further. He suggests that when we really reflect on that deep sense of connection, of being in relation to others, it points us towards something that transcends the human even. He believed that the very existence of these deep personal relationships, with all of their messiness, it actually suggests that there's a personal God.
Okay, now we're getting existential.
Yeah.
He's saying that our capacity for love, empathy, all of that, it's not just some human thing we've developed. It's actually a reflection of something bigger.
Exactly. He saw human community as this kind of microcosm of this larger divine community, and that we're all bound together by a personal God who exists in relation to all of us.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. So instead of picturing God as this distant, like, impersonal force, we can maybe start thinking about it more like this network of relationships.
That's the idea, and it really challenges those more traditional images of God, the ones that are all about obedience, hierarchy, fear. McMurray's offering something way different, something grounded in love and connection.
I like the sound of that way better, to be honest. But how does Jones bring all of this together? He's the one who calls it relational theology, right?
He does, and he argues that relational psychoanalysis gives us this much more nuanced and honestly hopeful picture of human experience, compared to Freud's whole instinct-driven model.
Right.
Like, it actually makes space for spirituality, even mystical experiences, without just explaining them away as some, like, side effect of our biology.
It's like we can acknowledge how complex human beings are, the good, the bad, all of it, without losing sight of that potential for something more.
100%. And Jones sees this really fascinating convergence happening between relational psychoanalysis, feminist thought, and this emerging relational theology. They all highlight how important connection is, empathy, and really seeing the other person in all of their complexity.
Which feels like a pretty radical shift away from those, like, traditional top-down views of religion, the ones that are obsessed with rules and who's in charge.
It's a different way of thinking about it, that's for sure. And Jones actually goes there. He talks about how science often tries to explain everything by breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces, what he calls reductionism. But he points out that this approach might be missing something really important.
It's like trying to understand how beautiful a painting is by just analyzing the chemical composition of the paint, right?
Exactly. You miss the big picture.
Yeah.
And Jones, drawing on feminist critiques of science, he points out that this whole reductionist approach might not be as objective as it pretends to be. It might actually be a very masculine way of seeing the world, detached, controlling, focused on dominance.
Hold on. Are we saying that the way we know things, like even the methods of science, could be influenced by gender? That's a really interesting idea. I'm not even sure what I think about that.
It's definitely something to think about. And Jones doesn't shy away from those tough questions. Like, he even asks if relational psychoanalysis falls into the same trap, especially those theories developed by men. A lot to unpack there.
I'll say. But before we go down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
tell me about this guy, D.W. Winnicott.
Oh, yeah. Winnicott.
Jones talks about him in something called transitional space. And this is right up my alley. I love this kind of stuff.
You're in for a treat. He was really fascinated by that sense of magic and creativity that's so strong in childhood, but we often, sadly, lose as we grow up.
Tell me about it. Okay, so what is transitional space all about? Okay, so last time we were on this roll, right, talking about Bird, McMurray, and how our understanding of like what it means to be human, it's all rooted in relationships.
Totally. And then we even started to touch on Winnicott's idea of transitional space, that really cool concept.
Right, that magical space where all that imagination and creativity thrives, especially in childhood, you're saying.
Exactly. Winnicott thought this transitional space acts like a bridge between our inner world and the outside world. It's where we play, we use symbols, and start to, like, make sense of everything.
It's like a testing ground for reality, in a way.
In a way, yeah. And what's really wild is that he saw this third area, as he called it, as existing outside of that whole objective versus subjective thing.
So it's not just about like retreating into fantasy. It's more about using imagination to actually connect with what's real, but in a different way.
Yes. It's this crazy paradox. We're both discovering meaning and creating it at the same time. And get this, Winnicott thought that religious experience also lives in this transitional space.
Wait, are you saying faith is like a child's game? I mean,
That's not exactly what I'm saying. But Winnicott's point is that we can't just reduce religious experience to true or false. It's not that simple, you know?
okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
It exists in this in-between space where meaning is, like, found and made at the same time, just like art, music, even an imaginary friend.
Instead of getting bogged down in, proving whether God exists or not, maybe we should be asking different kinds of questions. Like, how do these experiences make people feel? What meaning do they bring? How do they change how we live?
Exactly. Winnicott opens up this whole other way of thinking about the relationship between psychoanalysis and religion. It's not about one trying to disprove the other. It's about realizing they're both dealing with those big, messy questions of what it means to be human, that search for meaning, the longing to connect, wanting something more.
So maybe less like opposites and more like two sides of the same coin. Which makes me think about this big question that Jones tackles. Do our very personal experiences of God actually match up with some kind of objective reality? Like, is there really a God out there? This feels big.
It's a huge question, and Jones explores this through the work of Moshe Halevi Sparrow, who talks about a God-relational approach.
Okay, God relational. What does that even mean?
It's not just about analyzing religion through psychology. It's about bringing this idea of a real objective God into therapy. Like, if God does exist, then we have to have some way of knowing him, experiencing him, even if it's not perfect.
But wouldn't that mean our ability to have these experiences, to experience God, it's almost like hardwired into us by God?
That's exactly what Sparrow is suggesting. He believes there are two kinds of development happening. One where we internalize those early relationships, like with our parents, and another, he calls it a deocentric one, where we connect with the actual God, through these mechanisms God created.
Whoa. So it's like we're designed to be able to have this relationship.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And it gets even more interesting. Sparrow says we relate to both the real God and our internal image of God at the same time.
So almost like with our parents, we have that image of them in our minds, but it doesn't mean they don't exist outside of that.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. And I can see how that would be comforting for someone who's religious. It's like validating their faith while also acknowledging how much their own experiences matter.
Yeah.
But, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, isn't that kind of avoiding the question of whether our image of God is actually accurate?
Right, and Jones points out that Sparrow might be a bit stuck in that old objective versus subjective binary. Remember Winnicott and transitional space.
Right, that in-between space.
Maybe God's reality, much like the reality of, say, that childhood imaginary friend, it exists in that paradoxical space where meaning is both discovered and created.
So less about proving it and more about recognizing the power of the experience, what it means for us, regardless of whether it fits into some, like, objective truth.
You got it. And that's what's so cool about this relational approach. It allows for this way more nuanced view of faith, of spirituality, without dismissing it as just fantasy or wishful thinking.
This has been amazing. I mean, we've gone from Freud's whole instinct-driven thing to this whole relational turn in psychoanalysis.
Right. And we talked about Buber's I, Thou, McMurray on community, and even touched on that fascinating idea of transitional space with Winnicott.
And we've seen how these ideas, they can totally change how we understand theology. opening the door to this more relational, less rigid view of faith, of what it means to be spiritual.
It really makes you think twice about some of those old assumptions.
It does. We even
Yes.
talked about, like, the limits of what we can really know,
Yeah.
recognizing that how we experience something like the divine, it's always going to be shaped by our own unique, messy human perspective.
And maybe that's not a bad thing.
Right. Like maybe it's an invitation to approach these big questions with more humility, more curiosity.
That sense of wonder.
Exactly. Which brings us to Jones's final thought. Even with all the insights that psychoanalysis offers, that God question, it's still a mystery. And maybe that's okay. So after this deep dive, I'm thinking, if how we understand God is always filtered through our own experiences, does that mean faith is more about the journey than the destination?
Ooh, I like that.
Something to ponder.
It really is. And, that exploration, the journey itself, it can be incredibly powerful.